and welcome to Forecasting China's Growth and Influence. This panel discussion is intended to be a discussion of China's growing economic, political, and military power with the objective to identify the most significant trends, the potential impact of China's transition to a new generation of leaders next year, and the implications of these issues for U.S. China relations. Moderating our panel is John Bussey. John is the Assistant Managing Editor at the Wall Street Journal. He is responsible for the team of reporters covering the nation's capital, domestic and foreign policy, regulation, and national politics. We also have David Shambaugh. He's a professor and director of the China Policy Program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He is a recognized internationally as an authority on contemporary Chinese affairs and international politics and security of the Asia-Pacific region. We have Richard McGregor, is in the Washington Bureau Chief of the Financial Times, a leading Times coverage of the American politics of managing DC-based team of reporters. And lastly, we have Derek Scissors, a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where he focuses his studies on the economics of China and India as a research fellow for economics in the Heritage Asian Studies Center. Gentlemen.
Well, thank you. So we have an hour to talk about China. I can't think of, other than the fall of the Soviet Union, in our collective generation, I can't think of a more significant event than the reintegration of the global economy. Economies that, for one reason or another, have been offline, now reintegrating into one competing global one, and of course, China is at the forefront of that. This is going to be a story that in all aspects of our lives will affect us for the rest of certainly our lives and our kids as well. So we have an hour to address the various topics. I should just kind of amend. I just transitioned out of the Washington Bureau Chief job, which was that job description out of New York, now writing a column. And the amount of time that China enters into that orbit is much more than I would have expected. It's pretty much anything that you're writing about domestic U.S. business now, it has a big China element. So we have broken this large topic down into three broad areas. David's going to talk about the global influence of China, its diplomatic initiatives, some of its military initiatives as well. Richard's going to speak a bit more about the domestic politics. He's an expertise in this. He's been focused on the domestic politics of China. As you well know, we're moving into a power transition in China. That's a extraordinarily interesting moment in the country. It's going to coincide with our electoral cycle as well, interestingly. And Derek is going to speak about China's economy. I think that what we'll try to do, we'll do our best to have 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So we're going to cram all this into 45 minutes. And Derek, I'd like to start with you. Let's talk about China's economy, since that seems to, in so many ways, intersect with what we're talking about here in the United States.
Okay, thanks. We don't have a lot of time. I respond to the time limits by simply talking faster. If you find something I say completely incomprehensible or just wrong, please ask a question, and including after the session. I'm going to make a point that most of you are not going to agree with or maybe find surprising. China's economy is actually weakening now. It's not strengthening. And I don't mean it's weakening in the last month. I mean it's weakening over the last 5 years and maybe longer. And I'm going to try to do this very quickly, which is going to provoke a lot of discussion, but discussion is good. All right, when I say China's economy is weakening, not strengthening, I don't mean to say it's shrinking. It's still growing. But it's growing like someone who overeats is growing. Not that I would know anything about that. It's growing like a badly designed building that continues to get taller. Right? So it's getting bigger, but it's structurally getting weaker. Now, what is China overeating? The constituents of growth, and this hides a lot of very important material, but we can break growth down throughout history, every single country. They're coming from land, labor, capital, and innovation. On land, China has overexploited its natural resources. On labor, it has adopted unsustainable employment policies in response to demographic expansion. It is massively overspending, and it has adopted a series of unwise technology policies led by not protecting intellectual property rights, which has stunted domestic innovation. So in all four areas, China is pursuing unsustainable policies. What is contributing to Chinese growth is not going to last. That's what structural weakening is. Now, I love numbers, and I'm going to give you some now. In 2005 and in 2010, Chinese GDP growth and electricity production growth were about the same. And I include electricity production because a lot of people don't trust Chinese GDP. For good reason, it's smooth. It actually does this, and they report this. Electricity production also has problems, but this is not a data talk. So 2005, 2010, the Chinese are reporting a similar economy. 2010 is actually much stronger than 2009. It's actually stronger than 2011 has been to this point. China's economy in 2011 is quite weak. Even so, with 2010 being a strong year in the last three, to get the same results as 2005 required lending growth that was twice as fast, and on top of a giant base. China is much more leveraged now than it was 5 years ago. The leveraging hasn't kept up with growth. There's been rapid growth, there's rapid leveraging. The Chinese are lending and borrowing a lot more money to get the same results as they did in 2005. You might think of an analogy in the United States about the year 2006, say, versus the year 2003. Lots of leveraging doesn't mean that you're doing well. It just means that you think you're doing well right up until the crash. If you follow China, you know there's an investment-consumption imbalance. There's too much investment and not enough consumption. That's completely a function of this government. There was no investment-consumption imbalance in 2002. In 2005, the investment-consumption ratio, where you don't want it to be too big a difference, was 1.33 to 1. So investment was a third bigger than consumption in 2005. That was a bit dubious. In 2010, investment is twice as big as consumption. Okay. That's not dubious, that's unprecedented. And again, there are big problems in the statistics, and if people have different numbers in their heads, I'd be happy to talk about it after the fact. The trend is clear. China went from a, I don't think this is a great idea situation in 2005, to this is a really, really bad idea situation in 2010. Land, for overusing natural resources. China imported 275 million tons of iron ore in 2005, which was a lot. It imported 619 million tons in 2010. The bulk of global iron ore trade, not half, more than 2/3, is just Chinese imports. Now you might say, great, they're expanding. But that trade is to feed steel and construction industries that the Chinese themselves say have massive overcapacity. So they're drawing in iron ore from China and around the world to feed industries that they know are too big. They report every year as being in the too much capacity side. That's degrading their land resources in an unsustainable fashion to support concurrent growth. 2010 is 5 years closer to the end of the demographic expansion, which is expected around 2016. 2010 has seen 5 more years of re-centralization of the Chinese economy. And re-centralization is incompatible with the kind of innovation that sustains growth. It's true that governments can pick out particular projects, they do it in wartime all the time. But if you want broad, economy-wide, and sustained innovation, the private sector is what does that, not the state sector. So when China starts talking about indigenous innovation, they're ordering the Chinese companies to innovate. That doesn't work. The way you get companies to innovate is you protect their innovations through stronger intellectual property rights. They're moving in the wrong direction on innovation, like they're moving in the wrong direction on capital and land. I do want to talk with my colleagues and all of you, so let me just close up. If China were a market economy, it would already be in serious crisis. I would estimate growth is half as fast as it was last year. Growth was pretty fast last year, faster than they reported. Now it's much slower than they reported. I think it's still declining. The growth is still declining. China's not a market economy, which means it has many, many tools to fight downturns that are not available here. We can't just order our banks to lend whenever we want to. The Chinese can. Right? They can sustain a seemingly unsustainable situation. And that is important and valuable because it buys them time to change course. China's heading in the wrong direction now. They can buy time to change course. Greece can't buy any more time. They got to decide. The Chinese can buy time. That when I paint this portrait of a Chinese economy weakening, I'm not the people saying there's going to be a property market crash in 6 months and they're all doomed. They're heading in the wrong direction. They have time to change course, but if they don't change course, China's headed toward the wall. Land, labor, capital, innovation. What drives growth in China? None of them are on a sustainable path. Chinese growth is going to stop. Is it going to stop next year? No. Is it going to stop in 2 years? Probably not. But they're heading toward a period where China's going to stop growing, and we're going to reveal that this is a person, a country that has overeaten resources of various kinds, gotten a lot bigger, but it gotten less healthy.
How much of that, Derek, was as a result of a conscious decision, we're going to spend, and build, because we need to get through this period that Europe and the United States is similarly going through, which is a downturn in the global economy. So this is their stimulus version. It's not going to continue forever. It was meant to get through this 2 or 3 year period.
Part of it is that, not most of it. And I'll say that for 2 reasons. First of all, the investment consumption imbalance started before the 2008 stimulus. China was moving towards a more investment-driven economy before that, and their lending had increased to support that investment before that. So this dates back to, there's big arguments about when it started, 2003, 2004. It's certainly before 2007, 2008. Now, they accelerated in 2007, 2008. But that gets to the second part. Well, when are they going to unwind?
Yes.
Right? I mean, is the world economy going to magically recover and China can go back to doing what it was going to do? Maybe, maybe not. Can you just, after you've subsidized these industries, say, all right, we're cutting you off now? No. I mean, that's one of the big things the Chinese say. Well, you can't expect us to stop lending. All our loans would go bad if we stopped lending. They got themselves hooked.
Yeah.
Right? And the addiction process started before 2007, 2008. It just got worse in 2007, 2008.
Is there any evidence that a shift from an exporting economy dependent upon exports to an economy that can sustain itself through domestic consumption? Has there been progress toward that goal, or has it gone the other direction?
I don't like your question, sorry. China's economy is not dependent on exports. It hasn't been dependent on exports for a long time. There was an export surge that had to do with excess U.S. demand that boosted their balance payment surplus. China's economy is dependent on investment. Exports are an outgrowth of that. You invest too much, you produce too much, you dump the excess on world markets. Exports are the valve. The driver for the Chinese economy is investment. And I use this all the time. The State Council in 2004, 7 years ago, said, we got too much investment and not enough consumption. Every year since then, investment share of the pie has gotten bigger, and the consumption share of the pie has gotten smaller. So if you look at investment and consumption, they're getting less balanced.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Is there any evidence that China's paying inflation, wage rates rising, is a gain for the West? That is, some companies that are manufacturing in China for the global market, not for the domestic market, but for the global market, might move manufacturing back to the United States. We see episodically instances of this. Is there any kind of broader trend emerging?
There is a trend that started to emerge. It's too early to tell. There's a lot of unemployed rural labor in China that can still be brought into the cities. So people talking about Chinese wages are just going to rise and rise and rise. We'll see. But if costs are going to push people out of China, they're not going to push them to the United States. I mean, they're going to push them to Vietnam, they're going to push them to Bangladesh, and push them to Indonesia, and push them to Mexico, to other low-cost producers. Yes, certain firms are going to relocate back to the U.S., but the massive jobs and production is going to spread around the world. You opened by talking quite correctly about China being in the forefront of globalization. What it's done to this point is draw jobs from all over the world to China. What we're seeing maybe now is jobs leaving China going all over the world, not primarily back to the U.S.
Richard, the political transition. This is very big for China. It's going to be big for the rest of the world as a result of it being big for China. Tell us some of the dynamics at work and personalities and how this might change China.
Well, I don't think it will change China greatly, but let me just set the scene. I think it's very important when you're looking at China. We all visit China and you see all the fantastic sort of shopping malls, Louis Vuitton shops and the like, and people driving around in Mercedes in and out of their sort of gated communities, and you forget that, you think that China is not communist anymore. I think the best way to describe China, and this comes from an actual Chinese official, is that China does not have a communist system, but it has a communist government. And let me explain that. For all the sort of massive market reforms that China's had over the past 30 years, the Communist Party has in fact entrenched itself in power by focusing just on on three levers of power. The party controls the army. Just remember that is the party's army. It is not the country's army or the government's army. The party controls propaganda or media. I mean, the media is a lot more open in China these days because of various reasons, internet competition and the like. But ultimate control rests with the propaganda ministry, which is a party ministry. And the third leg of power of the Communist Party is personnel. The party still controls all manner of personnel appointments in companies, in universities, in think tanks like Eric. They're appointed by the Communist Parties, not the Heritage Foundation, and the like. So let's first be clear about that. The Communist Party, with 80 million members, is still very much in power. So that the Communist Party matters. So next year, around the member summit, China will have its selection, not election. They have a 5-year Communist Party Congress. And this is a very, very important one. Hu Jintao and Shambaugh will both be stepping down from power, and they'll be replaced most likely by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang as premier. Now, this would, in effect, be the only second time since the Communist Party came to power in 1949 when there will be a peaceful, orderly transition of power to a new leadership. The first time was in 2002. And even then, I think, had the fingerprints of the old guard on it, because theoretically, Hu Jintao had been tapped on the shoulder many years ago singled out by Deng Xiaoping. So the fact that the party can have an orderly and peaceful transition of power is enormously important. The two people I spoke about, Mr. Xi and Li, were sort of designated as the number 1 and the number 2 at the last party congress in 2007. So in effect, if they get 2 5-year terms, as the present leadership did, China will have chosen its top leadership in 2007 until 2022. Now, that is either stability or calcification, one or the other, I'm not sure which. But it's nonetheless very, very important because they will set the tone for the country. They're not autocratic rulers. China is far too complicated now for a strong man or woman rule. You can't have a Mao Zedong, you can't have a Deng Xiaoping, even Jiang Zemin in some respects is a bygone era. It's consensus rule at the top of the Politburo, which is why both those leaders, we know a fair bit about them, but they don't, before they come to office, before they ascend to the highest office, it's not like in a democracy. They don't get out in front of the debate and try and distinguish themselves. They're not able to pre-position a set of policies clearly within the bureaucracy which are theirs. But once they get in there, they will try and distinguish themselves in some fashion from their predecessors. And that's important because no matter what you think about who and when, and whether they've been very weak leaders or weak leaders constrained by a system based on much more on consensus, what they have done is, they've made a difference, for better or worse, as Derek said, but certainly under them, because China's richer, health spending has gone up dramatically, education spending has gone up dramatically, but state control of the economy, the commanding heights of the economy has been entrenched, if not by their policies, by the 2007-8 stimulus. The next question, obvious question, is what does Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang stand for? That's a much harder question to answer. Just briefly, I think the Communist Party in many respects is kind of like a balance between meritocracy and aristocracy. Xi Jinping comes from a big party background, Li Keqiang doesn't. That gives them a different set of networks, in some respects factions, but I wouldn't overplay that. But as to determining what particular view they will have on various issues, it's much, much harder. I'll just conclude by making one further point. Let's not make the dumb mistake that Westerners usually make when there's a new leader comes in China. When Hu Jintao came in, everyone said, of course he's going to be more like us, of course he's going to be more democratic, etc., etc., etc. Don't count on that. They're captors of the system, they've come up through it. They believe in Communist Party rule, and we should base all our assumptions around that.
If you had to make a guess, though, from the little that we do know, is it likely to be another dot on the current trajectory line for Chinese leadership, or might there be some variation in that?
I certainly think so as far as the economy goes. The incoming Premier Li Keqiang, I don't think has the power within the system, the forcefulness, the personality to be a transformative figure like Zhu Ji was, for example. But if you go up to the presidency and party secretary and Xi Jinping, it would scarcely be, it would be almost impossible to find a blander personality than Hu Jintao. You know, total charisma bypass. In private and in public, as far as I can tell. Xi Jinping seems to be a much more open figure, much more comfortable in his skin, much more talkative. You're much likely to get a straighter line from him. The Chinese are preparing for good relations with the U.S. very assiduously. When Vice President Joe Biden did his trip over to China recently, he spent a remarkable amount of time, 6 to 8 hours, one-on-one with Xi Jinping, which I think is unprecedented. And so he's putting his personality on the leadership already. But whether there's a great transformation of foreign policy, domestic economic policy that Derek talked about, it's far too early to tell for that.
And tell us the role that the military plays in this dynamic of leadership selection. On the one hand, the party controls the military, theoretically. On the other, there's a fair amount of currying of favor that needs to go on among the leadership to ascend. And you see bits and kind of blipping up on the radar screen, a test of a quasi-stealth fighter, discussions of the completion of the refitting of this aircraft carrier, dragging lines in Vietnam. What are we to make of all that static and the role of the military?
Well, Dave is a real expert at this. I'll just say a couple of things. I don't take this line that the military is getting out from under the control of the party. I don't believe that. But the role of the military is greater. In the 80s, Deng initially starved the military of money to concentrate on economic development. But China's global interests are greater. They have more money for a bigger military. The military, in that respect, is a much greater actor in sort of internal bureaucratic fights over money and has a bigger voice. The Chinese system is more open generally. Therefore, many of these sitting and retired military types feel able to speak out. In the military, they have greater protection in their ability to do that. And in some respects, I think either to get resources or because they are genuine, have a genuinely deep or zealous nationalistic streak. I think the military has draped itself in the flag as the protector of resurgent Chinese nationalism, which is a very powerful force within the country. And I think that is reflected in all the sorts of statements you see coming out.
Lastly, we talked about politics at the top of China. Tell us what's happening in the rest of China, if you could. I've always thought that as economic mobilization goes, political mobilization eventually has to follow because you empower new power centers through economic enfranchisement. I don't know whether that's happening. What's happening in the rest of China? Are people freer, or are they expressing themselves politically through various mechanisms more, or not?
People in China are undoubtedly free than 30 years ago to live their lives as they want. You can buy a Mercedes, live in a big house, send your kids to Harvard, holiday in California or Australia, wherever, as long as you don't get involved in organised politics. You're also free to speak your mind about that sort of thing, but don't sort of push your point. That's true. I think also one of the great tensions in China is, yes, the party holds all the levers of power, but you have a developing professional classes, lawyers who want to be lawyers, judges who want to be judges, journalists who want to be journalists, and there's a natural tension developing between all those groups of people who want to do their jobs properly and party controls, which is why the party tries to colonize all these professional bodies as well as tries to colonize and infiltrate the private sector. So far I think the party, if you've got 10% growth, you can cover up a lot of this stuff. When growth eventually levels off, be it in 2016 or 2020, when the demographic crunch really kicks in and the workforce shrinks, that's when I think the tenacity and the credibility of the party rule, party control will really be tested. There's lots of fights between these groups, lots of tensions. Some people get locked up, but I think the party prefers not. They want to co-opt people rather than coerce them. But once the economy slows down, once the urban middle classes, which I think were the incubators of any general trends of democratization in the rest of Asia, become losers rather than winners out of the present system, that's when I think things start to get interesting.
Excellent, thank you. David, these are huge forces at work, economic and political. Talk to us a little bit about the resulting influence that China now has globally, and how it might change as a result of this.
Right. Well, first of all, just fascinated by what my colleagues just said. Can't wait to get into the discussion amongst us and between us and the audience. And second, I just like to thank the British Council for inviting me to this annual conference. Derek had a challenge trying to compress the Chinese economy into 5 minutes. I really had a challenge trying to compress their global role and position into 5 minutes. So let me see if I can take maybe 1 minute on 5 different dimensions of China's global role. The first of which is I would call China a global actor, not yet a global power. In fact, I'm just finishing a book called China Goes Global, and the subtitle of the book is called Partial Power, or at least at this moment the working subtitle is called Partial Power. That's kind of the argument of the book, is that the Chinese are present now at an unprecedented way in all regions of the world, on virtually all dimensions of international affairs. Their footprint is indeed very broad, broader than ever before, but it's not particularly deep on many issues, including, surprisingly, I would argue, and maybe Derek would agree with me, the economic dimension. I was fascinated by what he just said about, in response to your question about trade. Trade is indeed where we feel the Chinese impact, indeed most of the rest of the world, even developing countries like Mexico. But if you look at other dimensions of China's global economic footprint, its overseas direct investment, and its overseas aid, overseas development assistance, it's not particularly large. China is the world's 5th largest now. Derek has a wonderful website that tracks Chinese overseas investment. I think they're the world's 5th largest overseas investor now, $60 billion last year, which is growing, to be sure, but not much, actually. It's going up, sort of 5 to 10 billion per year. And it's concentrated primarily in raw materials and in mergers and acquisitions, many of which failed, in fact. They have a very bad record in M&As, not into greenfield, so-called greenfield investments. Yes, it's the world's 2nd largest economy, and it is influential. But look at the meeting in Cannes right now in France. The Chinese are certainly there. The sovereign debt crisis is overshadowing the meeting. It's certainly the dominant issue on the agenda. Europeans are wondering, yes, the Chinese will contribute to some extent to the bailout fund, but the Chinese are very ambivalent. They're sitting back, we don't know to what extent. But that's kind of symptomatic of my argument. I think they're still rather passive. They're still not fully engaged. They're quite ambivalent about a number of dimensions of their overseas activities. And if they're ambivalent on the economic side, they're even more ambivalent on these other 4 dimensions, briefly: diplomatic, cultural, military, and global governance. Let me just quickly pick those off. Diplomatically, yes, they're present in bilateral relationships and in almost all multilateral meetings now. But they're not influential. They're kind of at the table, but they're not shaping outcomes. They're not even shaping the agenda, except to protect their own national interests on the agenda. They've got their key issues, Taiwan, Tibet, a couple of other things that they always try to keep off the agenda. But you don't see China in the middle of trying to resolve any major global issues, including the North Korea problem. Yes, they're in the middle, but I wouldn't say they're exactly working very positively to resolve it. This is a country, in my view, that's not very influential. It's very narrowly self-interested. It is interested more in being at the table, the kind of status that that brings, than actually contributing to global governance, about which I'll say something in a second. So diplomatically active, but not terribly influential, in my view. Culturally, to the extent this is an element of any country's foreign policy and international status, it is. Zhou Enlai, of course, has taught us all about soft power. The Chinese have now read Zhou Enlai, and they are fixated on Zhou Enlai, and soft power has become, since 2007, Hu Jintao himself spoke about it in the last Party Congress report. It's now on the agenda. They just held a plenary session 2 weeks ago, the 6th plenum of the 17th Congress, devoted to what? Culture. Can you imagine, the American leadership retreating to a pine plantation in eastern Maryland or something and talking about the role of culture in our society? We should, perhaps. Well, the Central Committee went off for 5 days and talked about culture, both domestically, because they're worried that there's such a moral vacuum in the society, but internationally. How do we build our international image? They're aware, they read the Public Review and the BBC and other public opinion polls, they're aware that they have a mixed to negative image virtually everywhere in the world. A few exceptions to that, Pakistan, for example, Palestinian territories. But everywhere in the world it's mixed to negative. So they are investing heavily in trying to improve their international image, doing the same thing they do with what Derek described, everything else, invest. Like they're taking this kind of planned economy approach to trying to buy soft power, like high-speed rail. They think there's some sort of Walmart where you can go into and then go down the soft power aisle, and sort of purchase it. It doesn't work that way. It tells us, that soft power is all about the intrinsic value of society, not a government, but government contributes to it. And it's sort of magnetic, like a magnet. People are attracted to you, and you therefore are able to co-opt others, not coerce others. That's influence. The Chinese don't have that, I would argue. You don't find people defecting to China because of their political system or their society. Their asylum rate.
Except our manufacturing base. But
the asylum rate in China, I think, is probably next to zero. So the point here is that while they understand the importance of image and soft power and they're investing in it, they don't have it. They don't have a Hollywood. They don't have all the other traffic of soft power. Fourth, and fairly quickly, military security. You asked about, and we spoke about a little bit, with the exception, I would say, of ballistic missiles and cyber capacity. In fact, there's a report in the FT today on the cyber report that was given on the Hill yesterday by the American Intelligence Community. Those are two elements of China's security military footprint that are indeed global, and they can reach out and strike anywhere. But other than those two important elements, I would say China's military is very much still a regional military at best. In fact, its projection capacity is not really more than a couple hundred nautical miles offshore. Navy, air, and other assets. It's growing. Yes, they've got this sort of nascent aircraft carrier. And I'm not trying to downplay the military modernization. In fact, it's been quite impressive over the last decade plus. It shows what investment, again, will yield 14.5% per year over 12 years. You can buy a lot, and they have bought a lot. And it surprised a number of us in our assessments of what they could not do. Take submarines, for example. They now have an increasingly robust submarine force that is sailing further and further out of the Western Pacific. And they are increasingly trying to acquire blue water capability to get into the Indian Ocean and go elsewhere. But this is still a military, despite having the world's second largest budget and largest land force and I think second largest navy. So it's not an insignificant military, but it's not one that is going to sail into the Caribbean tomorrow or land forces in the beach of California or something. Maybe Oregon, or Florida. So we can come back to that, but I think we need to keep the military dimension kind of in perspective, which this city, I think sometimes gets out of perspective. Finally, global governance. This is an area of kind of umbrella category of diplomacy for all these transnational threats and challenges, affairs, from climate change to economic security and piracy and many so-called non-traditional security issues. Here we find the Chinese very ambivalent. They know they have to do something because of the fact they are a major actor in the world, but they will do only as much as they have to, so as not to get criticized for not doing enough. So we find them, yes, contributing to peacekeeping forces. We see them sending ships to the anti-piracy force off of Somalia. We see them as an aid donor, significant aid donor to Africa, which is a mixed story in itself. But this is a country that does not buy into the liberal internationalist agenda that really underlies the whole concept of governance. They are opposed to it, frankly, and ambivalent at best. So they will do only as much, I would argue. They see it as a tactic. Multilateralism for them is a tactic, not a philosophy, not the way to do diplomacy. It's still a very state-centric, narrowly interested, realist, hard realist country. But they realize they've got to do these things kind of for image purposes. So where does this add up to? Well, it adds up to the fact that China is a global actor, and the United States is a global actor, and therefore, in fact, we're the only two global actors on the planet. Really, Russia, Europe, other Asian countries are not global actors. So we, the Americans, have to now deal with China in parts of the world that we've never dealt with before, including Latin America. And on issues and in ways that we've never dealt with. But I don't think, and their influence, their role is growing, but their influence is not. So I think the key is really to understand ourselves and our own interests in these different regions and on these different issues. Not really be worried about excessively China's role.
Interesting. Election cycles tend to bring China into focus because it enters into the election rhetoric. So when Clinton was campaigning, Bill Clinton, there were butchers of Beijing, and then suddenly he's campaigning to get into the WTO. Once he's elected, president, same thing happens with Bush. There are strategic competitors, we have strategic partners. It has seemed to me that the trend line, wherever it is in the relationship between the U.S. and China, whether it's okay, not great, or good, not terrible, that has always improved slightly over the years. And you see the rhetoric change once you have a president elected. But I wonder now whether that dynamic is changing at all, because the American business community is having a rougher go in China, certain sectors of it at least. Indigenous innovation is policies and that sort of thing, technology transfer requirements to enter the market are contributing to that. And so they're losing a voice on Capitol Hill. That was a big proponent, advocate for China. So my big, broad, generalized question, where would you measure the relationship between the U.S. and China right now? Is it continuing very slowly improving that trend line, or is it altering in some way?
Well, I'm not an expert on American domestic politics. I'd like Richard to know more about Chinese politics. So it's interesting, your observations about the business community and the shifting domestic balance. I describe the U.S.-China relationship at present as fragile stability. It's stable, which is better than unstable, but it's fragile for a number of reasons. And it only stabilized, I would argue, this year, 2011, after an 18-month pretty steady decline, not free fall, but ever since President Obama visited Beijing in November 2009 until President Hu visited this city in January of this year, the relationship was just getting buffeted, hammered on all number of areas: economic, diplomatic, security, domestic, so on. Since January, however, I think we've had a stabilization of the relationship. The strategic economic dialogue in the spring helped. Biden's visit this summer helped. But it's fragile. And it's fragile for a number of reasons, including the domestic politics of both countries. And if what you say is correct about the American business community now not being such a strong advocate of relations with China, which they have been, then they will join the American strategic intelligence establishment, which is already pretty well turned against China, and for good reasons. and NGOs who have difficulties with the Chinese for various reasons of their work, human rights or other, then we could have a bit of a sea change in our domestic politics on China. China has not really entered presidential campaign politics that much, despite what you said about the rhetoric. Once you get to the actual election cycle, it never has before. This year it might. And so we'll have to see how that plays out, but it's a fragile stability. We don't really have a bipartisan consensus on anything in this country, much less China. So I'm concerned, and the Chinese, for the reason Richard just indicated, are going through their own transitions, and Eric too. So this is a lot of domestic volatility on top of this global competition, if you will, that I've tried to describe. And it's a bit unsettling.
Interesting. Let me put this next question to the group. I don't think I heard the word currency come up in these three presentations. And yet, if you walked, kind of out of this hotel, maybe just into the audience, that would be very much on people's minds. Senate action, debate, a conviction, at least in the political circles, that this is somehow a silver bullet for our economic problems with China. Are we talking, or is the Senate talking about the wrong issue or the right issue?
I don't bring up currency because I have to deal with it every single day. But thanks for not letting me get past Friday. Obviously there's a political dimension to the currency argument. It comes up, if you watch the pattern, I've been doing it for a long time, Congress comes back from seeing its constituents over the summer break, and in September, they're all angry about China currency. And so the constituents are angry about China currency, and then the question is that useful? Is it going to be productive? And the answer is no. If you look at a graph, a very simple graph of the value of the Chinese currency, the renminbi against the dollar in the last 20 years, and then a graph of U.S. unemployment, they have nothing to do with each other. So this stuff that you hear from Congress about, we're going to create 1 million American jobs or 2 million or whatever number, they're just making that up. Now, having said that, there are real problems.
This is from a man who advised Congress.
Yes. My job is to walk across the street and say, no, you're wrong, don't do that. And then they either yell at me or they say, that's fine, leave my office, whatever. But the House has blocked the bill, and the House has blocked the bill at this point for a good reason. It won't work. Currency is not a silver bullet. What would you expect? All of you are involved in making complex economic and financial decisions. The U.S.-China economic relationship is gigantic. It has many dimensions, and we can then talk about Chinese purchases of U.S. treasuries for one, or what David referenced of Chinese outward direct investment. So there are many dimensions. Do you really think that one little thing is going to change everything? And from my standpoint, as I said, the Chinese government intervenes in the economy in a lot of different ways. Currency management is one tool, and it's a small one. You're playing whack-a-mole. Oh, change your currency policy. They're like, okay, we changed it. Oh, look, the trade deficit's still going up. I don't know why that's happening. Right? You can't do that. And if you put all your eggs in the currency basket or any single basket, you're going to be horribly disappointed. And the most effective thing, and I'll close on this, I say to members is, when this doesn't work, sir, what are you going to say then? And it's not going to work. Right? It's too big a relationship. You have to have a comprehensive approach, whatever it is, whether it's confrontational or cooperative. You focus on one thing, you're just asking yourself to be disappointed.
I mean, I'd like to have a big argument with Derek, but I think I agree with a lot of what he says. I think it's a vastly overrated issue. The US forced Japan to revalue its currency by a massive amount of plasma accord in 86 or 87. That didn't change the trade relationship a much greater deal. The salient point, I think, is that, as Derek says, that the intervention in the economy has many different ways in China. The currency has already been appreciating if you add in inflation, not by much. I mean, China does manipulate its currency, that's true, but it has nonetheless been appreciating, plus 6% for inflation or so, and I don't think that's changed trading patterns
per year.
Sorry, no, against the US dollar.
Per year.
Yeah, it's 10% if you add in inflation, thereabouts, but I think it's slowing down in China now because of the bill and because they're going into their own sort of election/selection year. And I think the trouble is it's a smelly little litmus test that everybody can understand. But I think the issue of state subsidies, cheap capital, cheap land, favoritism for technology and the like, the issue of government procurement, which is something the US and China are starting to grapple with now, I think are equally as important. The currency just sucks all the air out of the room, and I think that's a real pity. I think it had been changing, actually. The administration has shifted the debate a little bit, but once the Senate got involved again, I think it's obviously swung back.
Okay.
And massive subsidies that are about to get even larger for select industries in this next 5-year plan. I feel like we've been speed dating up here, and we have 10 minutes left for questions, and I don't want to short you on that. So if you could maybe get some folks approaching the microphone, and if you can just identify yourself and please keep your question brief. Thanks.
I do my best. Good morning. My name is Gary Brett. I'm the counsel from Western Massachusetts. The topic that you're speaking about is the growth and influence, of China based on innovation. There was a report in the Washington Post this morning, I think it was alluded to. There was a report on the Hill yesterday about industrial espionage against the United States and how we lose billions and billions of dollars in technology. And the primary actor has been identified as China. And I'm wondering how you reconcile our sort of cooperative efforts with China with the fact that China is the primary actor in stealing our innovation.
Excellent question. Who'd like to take a shot at that? Good.
Well, the report said publicly, actually, for the first time, what everybody's known for some time, namely it's China and Russia, that are the major perpetrators of cyber attacks, not only on the private sector in this country, corporate sector, but on indeed the U.S. government and many foreign governments. Been going on for some time. They try to penetrate foreign Commonwealth office in the UK, the Chancellor's office in Germany, many others. Very aggressive, offensive cyber program has been going on in China for a number of years now, largely from the Chinese military, but not entirely. And of course, with the cyber, you can't always track the origins of the attacks, covering their footprints very, very well. Nonetheless, it's a major threat. Industrial espionage is done by means other than cyber, by the way. And the Chinese have been very aggressive on that. They're the number one so-called hard target employed by the FBI for industrial espionage, and there's regular espionage. The Chinese, so there's no doubt about it, the Chinese are a very serious national security problem for us in these two areas, cyber and espionage, where they're married together. The Russians are as well. But I would just note that they're not the only cyber warriors in the world. Many countries, including this one, have rather robust offensive cyber capabilities, as well as certainly defensive to try and protect against attacks from countries like China and Russia. This is the nature of the new realm of the new military revolution, whatever it's called, the new technological military revolution. Chinese, though, are very aggressive about it. We've spoken to them about it for a long time. We need to continue to. They're not going to stop. Therefore, it's our responsibility to mount the most robust, impenetrable as possible defenses against this. But it's a very serious problem. I completely agree with you. And it's now beginning to get public attention that people inside the government and inside corporate America have known for some time.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Anu Bala from the Houston World Affairs Council. I just came back from a trip to China, and I was completely blown away, to say the least. I was so impressed with its development, its infrastructure, and as soon as I came back, the day after I came back, there was an article in the New York Times that read, as its economy sprints forward, China's people are left behind. And that's the sense I got when I was there. Talking to different people, they didn't seem happy at all. It seemed like the government was doing what it was doing. The people had a little bit more freedom, but they seemed to be working very hard to make ends meet. And it seemed like they saved a lot of money, and from the article I gathered that a lot of the capital that the government was using was people's savings. And I'm not sure if, if what I gathered was right, and I'd like some your thoughts on it.
So Richard, you were probably seeing people in cities, 55% of the population still on the farm in the rural sectors. What do you make of this? Are people happier because they have a lot more options ahead of them than they had in the past, and aspirational, or are they frustrated?
Well, I'm always a little bit hesitant about saying the Chinese think this or that, or they're happy or not. They're no doubt happier than they were 30 years ago. But I think that article, I'm not sure that I read it, but if there is great concern from the top, in theory, about the rich-poor gap. China is according to the last measure, using the Gini coefficient that I saw, the most unequal country in Asia in terms of income distribution, along with Nepal.
Number 2 in the world now.
Number 2 in the world now, behind Brazil or something. So that is a real problem, and I think the issue is one of fairness. I think in a funny kind of way, and I don't want to sort of make a comparison that you might think is valid here, but the Chinese in many ways are just as aspirational as Americans. In other words, I feel that they would tolerate income disparity if they thought it was based on fairness. And I think a lot of people who've made fortunes in China have done it by flipping land, which they got at a cheap price through government connections, or various, nefarious deals, or buying state assets, factories at a cheap price and the like. And that is one of the reasons for the massive wealth disparity. On top of that, the Communist Party and the private sector used to be at odds. They've now got a much greater interest in working together against the people, if you like, so-called. That's why if you look at the China rich list, about 30–40% of the top 100 billionaires, and they're real billionaires, are Communist Party members now. And that's a conscious policy by the Communist Party to get the rich and powerful and successful people into their ranks. So I think it's, the income disparity is obviously a massive problem, but I think it's more about fairness than the other way around. But having said that, there's still, enormous opportunity in China for people to make their lives, which, to make something, to transform their lives, and that wasn't the case before. So I'm a little bit reticent about saying that there's a 1.3 billion wealthy people.
Yeah. Can I just, a quick answer to your last point. The Chinese don't raise money. Chinese government doesn't raise money primarily through taxes. It doesn't affect the economy primarily through government spending. It does it through ordering state banks to lend. And state banks are lending people's money. And people don't have the option, normal people, of sending the money overseas. So they can keep the money in a mattress, or they can put it in a bank. And the bank is run by the state, and the state says lend to these companies. So they are, in fact, using people's money for government programs. And it's not tax money that you give up, all right, I've lost it. It's money that you think is yours, and it's going someplace else. And this is
at a low rate.
Yeah, and you're getting a very low return on it. So that is an element of worry in the Chinese populace.
I think we have time for one more question, and you are it.
Robert Litwin, Texas A&M University, College Station, Texas. I guess some of my question with one word, Taiwan. Historically, they've been like a trading partner for the United States. We continue to deal arms to them, and last week, the Chinese ambassador was on our campus, and he told us to keep out of this internal affair. Does our relationship with Taiwan affect our relationship with China, and should the United States change anything about it in the near to medium term?
I do my best to avoid discussing the Taiwan issue in public, at least. So you were at that conference where Ambassador John came to speak last week, and he said what the Chinese have been saying for more than 30 years. It is their internal affair, they argue. The United States has signed a communique in 1982 to reduce arms sales over time. We, the United States, have long since violated that communique by increasing qualitatively and quantitatively arms sales over time to Taiwan. So they have a legal point there, an important one. But your question is a good one. You know, all foreign policy issues should be reevaluated from time to time and not left on autopilot. Taiwan, to my mind, is one of those issues. It is not static. There has been tremendous change across the Taiwan Strait over the last few years. It is the most peaceful that it has been ever. The interchanges, economic, cultural, people to people, even government to government, are extraordinarily thick and increasing. And the military dimension has receded, therefore. And the so-called military balance across the strait, I argued for a while, kind of fiction, because it's quite out of balance. The mainland's military is considerably better by some degree than Taiwan. So whatever weapons the United States sells Taiwan under the fictional argument, in my view, of restoring some kind of fictional balance, is a fiction. It's being done for other reasons. The Taiwan Relations Act, American defense industries in Texas and elsewhere who want to employ American workers need the contracts. And then the other argument that's always given is it will strengthen Taiwanese resolve when they go to the negotiating table with the mainland. I've never accepted that either. Now I'm a bit on the periphery of this debate in Washington, but at least for the first time there is now a debate. There's always been axiomatic, the United States shall stand behind Taiwan and continue to sell weapons under the Taiwan Relations Act to Taiwan. Now in the last year we are finally having a debate in this city about this issue, and I think it's very appropriate because the situation has changed. And we need to re-examine our policy, particularly our arms sales policy. So we just sold another package of $6.4 billion worth of weapons to Taiwan a month ago. And we continue to do this. And I myself would think that the U.S. Congress should sort of re-examine this issue, as indeed the administration and others. So you raise a good question. I just think we should stay on autopilot.
Richard, you get the last word.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think it's pretty instructive that both the U.S. and China are backing the same candidate in the Taiwan election next January. Taiwan politics I've always found it's very confusing, domestic politics, but I think President Ma probably has a pretty good chance of winning. One of Hu Jintao's, I think, big achievements in foreign policy was to push the Taiwan issue off to the sidelines and let history take over, pulling it back from the brink that Jiang Zemin had taken it to. I'm sure David's right that these issues can't just be static; they have to be re-examined. But it's in a much better place than it was before. And frankly, I think that China has no interest. There's some people in China who would like to go back and put out Taiwan tomorrow, but I think most people in China realize that's an absolute disaster. Lose-lose for them. So I'm a little bit more relaxed about Taiwan policy.
Well, China, obviously, I think you've already concluded a big and fascinating topic. I just want to thank David and Richard and Derek and the World Affairs Council for hosting us. Thank you.